In every myth lies a memory, in every fantasy a forgotten truth. Before they were graceful warriors, before they were immortal icons, they were something more. This is their story. This is the Fantasy Files. Elves are among the most iconic beings in all of fantasy. They're known for their beauty, their grace, their magic, and their immortality. But where did they come from? And how did they become a pillar of modern fantasy? The origin of elves stretches back to the earliest beliefs of Northern Europe. Long before fantasy novels and tabletop games, elves lived in the minds of ancient people. The word elf comes from the Old English word Gealf. It also connects to the Germanic word Alp and the Norse. All these early names referred to mysterious beings beyond the mortal world. In Norse mythology, elves were divided into light elves and dark elves. The light elves lived in Alfheim, a realm of beauty and radiance. They were close to the gods and were said to be more beautiful than the sun. Dark elves were a different story. They lived underground. They were tied to shadow, death, and strange powers. These two types reflected a dual nature, one of wonder and one of danger. This duality would stay with elves through their entire history. The Prose Edda, a key source of Norse myth, describes light elves as spirits of air and light. It describes dark elves as twisted and secretive beings, but both were powerful, both were feared and respected. Early elves were not always kind. They could bless or curse humans. They were often blamed for illness and strange behavior. Farmers would leave offerings in the fields hoping to please the elves. People would whisper to the woods before entering them. Elves were real forces in the world of those who believed. These beliefs spread across cultures. In Germanic folklore, elves were known for mischief and illusion. In Celtic lands, they merged with the idea of the Fae. The Fae or fair folk included many kinds of spirits. Elves were just one form, but they shared traits like beauty, secrecy, and magic. Over time, these beings became more romanticized. They were no longer just forces of nature. They became characters in stories. In medieval ballads, elves became part of love stories. They danced under the moon. They whispered secrets to lonely travelers. They were tied to dreams and poetry. They were still dangerous, but also alluring. This balance of fear and fascination became their legacy. By the Renaissance, elves began appearing in plays and poems. Shakespeare used the word elf in his works. He helped blend the idea of elves with fairies and spirits. A Midsummer Night's Dream portrayed elves as tiny winged beings. This was a major shift. From tall, radiant spirits to small, mischievous creatures. This version of the elf lasted for centuries. Elves became symbols of childhood fantasy. They lost their edge and their power. But the ancient roots remained buried beneath the surface, and in the 20th century, something stirred. One writer would change everything. His name was J.R.R. Tolkien, scholar of ancient languages and myth, the father of modern fantasy. Tolkien did not invent elves, but he redefined them for generations to come. He reached back into the old texts and brought forth something new. Tolkien's elves were not tiny or playful. They were tall, wise, and immortal. They were warriors, poets, and philosophers. They lived for thousands of years. They loved beauty, but knew sorrow. They shaped the world and watched it decay. Tolkien's elves were divided into many houses and histories, created entire languages and cultures for them. He made them feel real. Their struggles were deep. They fought against darkness, chose between exile and loyalty. Middle-earth became their stage, and the Silmarillion, their tragic song. The Lord of the Rings showed them at the end of their age. Viewers saw Legolas, swift and sharp. Readers learned of Galadriel, radiant and wise. Tolkien's elves felt ancient yet noble. This version of the elf captured the world. It broke free from the fairy tale cage. It returned to the mythic roots of awe and terror. From Tolkien onward, fantasy elves followed his path. Games, novels, and films adopted his image. The elf had been reborn. As fantasy grew as a genre, Tolkien's elves became the gold standard. Every new world either followed his lead or reacted against it. Their long hair, pointed ears, and flowing speech became fantasy shorthand. In the decades that followed, elves appeared everywhere. They were in novels, role-playing games, movies, and art. But nowhere did they take root more powerfully than in video games. The early era of fantasy gaming drew heavily from Tolkien's world. Dungeons & Dragons introduced elves as a playable race. They were agile, intelligent, magical, and lived much longer than humans. Elves in Dungeons & Dragons were not just pretty warriors. They had deep lore, special classes, and unique cultures. Players could step into the shoes of ancient people and explore their long memory. This created a wave of creative worlds. Every game master added new details. Elves began to diverge from their source. Could be forest guardians, desert wanderers, icy seers, or underground exiles. Then came the era of digital gaming. With games like Ultima, EverQuest, and World of Warcraft, elves entered a new medium. Their style and lore evolved once again. In World of Warcraft, elves were given new stories. The Night Elves lived in ancient forests, bound to nature and moonlight. The Blood Elves were arrogant and tragic, once noble, now consumed by magic. These new forms were not copies of Tolkien, they were evolutions. They retained beauty and power, but their stories became darker, stranger, more complex. Games allowed players to live as elves, to make choices, to shape their destiny. This deepened the connection between audience and myth. Elves were no longer just background figures. They became protagonists. In Skyrim, players could become a high elf, a wood elf, or a dark elf. Each had its own culture, strengths, and history. The Elder Scrolls series, in particular, reshaped the image of elves. It gave them alien faces and complex politics. They were not just beautiful, they were dangerous, scarred by centuries of conflict. Elves in games and books now reflected more human themes. They dealt with racism, corruption, addiction, and identity. They mirrored our struggles while remaining otherworldly. No matter the world, certain traits remained. Elves were always tied to magic. They lived longer lives. They valued art, music, and wisdom. And they always stood on the edge of decline. This idea that elves are fading is one of their most powerful themes. It comes from Tolkien, but it resonates in every version. Elves are old. They remember more than we do. They are always watching the world change. In many stories, elves are not the heroes. They are the ones who once ruled, who now hide in forests or towers, who see the rise of man with silent eyes. This melancholy makes them feel real. It gives them gravity. Even when an elf draws a sword, you feel the weight of years behind it. Elves have also become symbols of perfection. They're beautiful, graceful, and talented. This has led to both admiration and criticism. Some writers see them as elitist or arrogant. Others portray them as flawed behind the mask. Modern fantasy often deconstructs the elf. It shows them as divided, struggling with pride, haunted by the past. This makes them more relatable, more human. In the Witcher series, elves do not live the noble lives of luxury like others portray them. They live in ghettos, fight for freedom. They are no longer shining immortals. They are survivors. In Dragon Age, elves were once gods and rulers. Now they are slaves and rebels. Their history was stolen, their memories erased. But still they fight to remember. These stories tap into deeper themes. Loss of culture, exile, the danger of forgetting. Through elves, fantasy explores what it means to lose your place in the world. But elves are not just victims. They adapt. They evolve. In every new world, they find a new role to play. Sometimes they rise. Sometimes they fall. Across fantasy, you will find high elves in shining cities, wild elves in tangled jungles, shadow elves in dark dimensions, snow elves in frozen wastes. The archetype bends, but never breaks. The image of the elf continues to change with each generation. Some are science fiction, some are horror, some are comic relief. But the core remains grace, memory, magic. Even in popular culture outside of fantasy, the elf has power. Elves appear in holiday tales, in children's stories, in superhero comics. The name has become universal. But the fantasy elf, tall, ancient, and magical, is now one of the strongest symbols in the genre. It represents a dream of something older, wiser, and more elegant than we can be. It also represents our fear that beauty fades, that even the brightest things must pass, that even gods can vanish. The elf reminds us that magic always has a cost, that time changes everything, and that memory can be both gift and curse. As fantasy continues to evolve, the elf will too. It will rise again in new stories, new forms, new voices, but it will never be forgotten. In the age of streaming shows and cinematic universes, elves have found new homes again. High-budget fantasy has returned, and with it, the need for familiar icons. Elves walk the screen once more. The Rings of Power reintroduced elves to a new generation. It explored the early ages of Middle-earth. It showed the ambition and sorrow of elven kind in new ways. Audiences debated the casting, the writing, the direction, but one thing was clear. Elves still held power over the imagination. Fantasy fans do not agree on everything, but most agree that without elves, the genre would feel empty. They are the backbone of mythic storytelling. Elves are not just decorative. They carry weight. They hold ancient truths, ask questions about time, about loss, about the cost of immortality. To create a good elf is to understand silence, stillness, dignity. A great elf does not need to speak much. They carry centuries in their eyes. In tabletop games, players still choose to play as elves, not because they are the strongest, but because they feel unique. Every elf is a story waiting to unfold. In literature, writers still build new kinds of elves. Some are urban, some are magical hackers in cyberpunk realms. Some are trapped between human worlds and fae kingdoms. In art, elves remain eternal. Whether painted on canvas or rendered in 3D, they draw the eye. They demand elegance. They breathe mystery. Across every form of media, the elf continues to inspire. It is not bound to a single tale or tone. It can shift like a shadow in the woods, or stand like marble in the light. And perhaps that is the secret of the elf. It is not just a race or a type of character. It is a symbol, a living idea. The elf speaks to our longing for something higher, something wiser, something that remembers what we forgot. When you hear the word elf, your mind conjures more than a face. It calls up an entire world, a forest in twilight, a song you almost remember, sorrow you cannot name. That is power, and that is why they endure. The world will continue to change. New stories will rise, others will fall. But the elves will remain, watching, waiting, whispering through the leaves. They are not gone. They never were. We're in the roots of the genre, in the bones of the forest, the ink of every fantasy map. Whether you see them as warriors or sages, as rebels or rulers, as exiles or gods, they are part of us now. Elves have walked through the dreams of mankind for thousands of years. From ancient myth to modern legend, they have never truly left us. To uncover more truths hidden behind the fantasy, subscribe and journey deeper. The Fantasy Files continues. Subscribe so you do not miss it.